Hello and welcome to the Paranormalist Podcast. I am your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this spring to turn back halfway into winter day?
I'm doing okay, but I stayed inside because that wind's really blowing.
We would like to thank all of our new subscribers. We really appreciate you finding us. We hope you enjoy our content. If you are not yet subscribed, please do us the courtesy of clicking the subscribe button, click the like. And YouTube, you can also click that little bell to be notified when we release new content. Everything about the Paranormalist Podcast is in the description, including our email address, where we would be happy to receive your thoughts, comments, show ideas. I do monitor all of those and send them to Patty. So realize that she doesn't get to read those directly, but I send them to her. And in her otherwise copious spare time, she can review those as well. So if you do have a request and we don't get to it, please don't think that we are ignoring you. We did get your requests, so I do look at those as often as they come in. So with that, though, I think I've said enough. What's our topic for today?
It's going to be the things inside the tree line.
That's an interesting topic. Okay.
Well, I came across the story, which took me down a rabbit hole, as anybody who's listened to this podcast knows. I love rabbit holes. So I came across all these amazing stories of creatures, different beings, some human, some not, inside the tree lines. So I thought I would share some of those. I thought they were really cool stories. So the first one we're going to talk about are black-eyed children. Now, we always hear the stories about how black-eyed children appear out of nowhere, knock on a car window or knock on the door, and there's usually two of them. And, they always insist they need to call their mom or they need help, and can you take me to my home or something. These are completely different. And I thought that was really interesting because I've told a story before about somebody I know personally who was working for a company, a food company in the area where they delivered food. It was a kind of a cold, gray, late February day, when it's short of light and it's raining. It was like a freezing, pelleting rain, and he was worried about getting the food there on time and not having an accident because, in Pennsylvania, you can get freezing rain really easy in February. If you're not careful, it's extremely dangerous conditions. There's nothing you can do with freezing rain. So he's trying to finish his job. He's driving down an area that's very rural, and there's like maybe a half dozen houses on this section of road. And out of nowhere, in the middle of all of this muck and mess, is a boy about 12 or 13 walking along with a little girl who seems to be about maybe 7 or 8. And they're pelted with rain, wet, and he passes them, and then he comes back, and his instinct is, oh my gosh, I can't leave him out here in the middle of nowhere. There's no houses anywhere for a couple of miles. And he goes back, and when he drives back past them, he realizes there's something wrong with them. They move funny, their eyes are funny, and they keep their heads down. And so he turns around and he goes back, still thinking I should probably, stop and pick them up, or at least find out what's going on, because there's no homes, just a couple old abandoned houses and a couple old abandoned barns. So as he comes back up the third time, they stop and they looked at him directly, and that's when he sees the black eyes. And he said he had chills. He just he felt paralyzed. He just hit the gas and left. So rural areas and things like that always catch my attention. So I wanted to share some of these stories. And interestingly enough, most of the stories come out of the Appalachian Mountains, which is where that exactly thing happened there. And it was, there's a gentleman here, starts out with one man who told his story, said, I always noticed that the porch light didn't touch their eyes. They came out of the woods on multiple nights, knocked on my door. But when I'd look out there, it was as though the light had simply vanished into them, like it was swallowed whole. And another woman claimed that they followed her car for miles, appearing in the rearview mirror, even though the road was empty. So she said, and if you leave the children behind and follow the road north, everything changes. It gets colder, it gets more rural, and these are some of the stories from that area, which, by the way, is part of Pennsylvania. So it's the black-eyed children encounters are fascinating in this area. So let's get a little bit of their stories. So this is one I thought was interesting. This was an impossibly thin figure slipping behind a spruce tree. So this is a story told from Sproul State Forest, which is also known as the Black Forest region in PA.
Mm-hmm.
The story actually dates back to the late 1800s, and people witnessed a account of a tall black figure near the pine trees along one particular part of what's now the state forest. And they would say that it would step out of a stand of spruces in that area. And it created the spruce trees kind of, they were tall, very thin, and they created kind of like a cathedral effect. But you were kind of looking at them because they're beautiful and unique kind of item in the woods, and out of that immediately would step this figure. He would also be very tall, very thin. And if you're watching him, he's almost as gray as the trees. And he steps back in and seems to melt into the trees. But one of the features that made him interesting to me was the fact that he was always described as having these black eyes that made you think something very evil was there in front of you. And then there's the story of a girl. This is the first story that came from modern times. It's from a gentleman by the name of Dale Hunsinger, was a highway worker. He spent 23 years clearing the rock falls and the winter debris on the mountain roads in that area. There's a place called the Runoff Ditch along a piece of that road. And it was late October, and he was working along that piece of road. It was getting dark, and that weird kind of gray darkness that sort of starts seeping in about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He's hurrying up to try to get done because he wants out of there. Frankly, he's cold, he's wet, he's miserable. His service truck had been up in the grade up there, and he's just about done. He goes back to the truck to throw the tools in, and that's when he sees a child standing in the runoff ditch to the right side of the road. She's a little girl. She's maybe 9 or 10. She's wearing a thin cotton dress, and is bitter cold. We're talking like 30s. And so he's thinking about, how did she get there? How did I miss her? Why hasn't she got a coat? And he glances down, and her feet are bare. Her skin is really pale, but her eyes are completely black, just like the holes in her face. They're not dark, they're not shadowed. They're literally like sockets filled with ink. She doesn't wave, she doesn't move. She just watches him. There's no expression on her face at all. He got into the truck and started it, felt bad about it. He rolled down the window and he called out to her, and he said, "Hey, are you okay? Do you live around here?" Nothing. He's like, "Do you need a ride?" Nothing. She didn't answer. She tilted her head a little bit and kind of listened to him, but didn't seem inclined to respond. Something about her creeped him out really bad. The eyes in particular, he would talk about later. He said he drove about a quarter of a mile away before this horrible dread hit him, and he pulled back over in a wide spot. He sat there shaking, telling himself he had imagined it, that it was just a lost kid, that he needed to go back. But when he looked into the side mirror, she was standing in the middle of the road behind him. He had drove a quarter of a mile. There's no way she could have walked it in that length of time. Not even running could she have made it there. She didn't seem winded or anything, just standing there with her head slightly cocked to the side, the black holes of her eyes, looking in his direction. Put the truck in gear, took off. He didn't stop till he hit the station where he worked, and then he told them what he had seen. He said, "I need somebody to come back with me." I think she's a little girl, but I didn't want to I didn't know what to do, so I thought I'd come and get help. So they go back and they start looking. It's dark, full dark by now, and they got their flashlights going. Somebody's like, we should just call the cops. And he's like, no, I don't want to call the police until I know there's, something that we can see to let them know I'm not imagining it. And he said, look, this is where she was at when I first saw her. So he thinks maybe her shoes are down there or something, So he goes down into the ditch and he looks around. It's completely dry in the ditch. There's no mud or rainwater or anything. And he looks at the grass. There's a frost all over the grass now as it's gotten dark. And in the ditch, right in the center of the ditch, the grass was melted where she had stood in a perfect circle. It was as though something had stood there a long, long time, but there was nothing there. He was really rattled by what happened to him. Another person from the area had hunting camp on that same ridge. And this family was called the Redding family. They had had the camp there for a long time, for 4 generations, in fact. And one of the family, a guy by the name of Tom Redding, in 1998, said he stayed there for the first time alone after his father had died. He'd been there lots and lots of times with his dad, but this was kind of, it was different. His dad had just passed away, and he was kind of keeping up the old tradition, but it felt odd. So he said he just wanted it to be quiet, and he wanted to feel close to his father again. So he decided that this weekend, they used to always go up on that particular weekend, and he decided to do it. It was in the middle of the evening. It was, just dark. And usually you don't see another soul up there at all. But on this night, he's sitting there kind of, watching the fire in the fireplace and thinking about his dad, and looked at his dad's picture up on the mantle. And that's whenever he heard it. This 3 taps on a door. Not hard, not frantic, not like somebody who was scared or lost, just very light, taps on a door. He opened the door expecting maybe one of the park rangers, or maybe a neighbor or somebody who got lost even, and was just glad to see civilization. Instead, there was a little boy standing on the porch. He guessed 12 years old, wearing a coat that was way too large. It hung off of him, literally down past his knees. The little kid's hands swallowed by the arms of this coat. And his hair was dark and all matted. His skin was really pale. The pale skin's the first thing that struck him. It was like this kid had never seen the sun. That was until the kid looked up, and his eyes were black from corner to corner. There was nothing, just that full blackness, no iris at all. And the boy said, "Can I come inside?" He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He just said in a flat voice, "Can I come inside?" Tom didn't know why, but he shook his head no. And the boy said it again, "Can I come inside?" Tom stepped back into the doorway and he said, "No, you can't." And he shut the door. This panic was wailing up in him. He couldn't explain it, but the back of his neck was crawling with fear. His goosebumps, and all the hairs were standing up on him. And he just had this feeling like he needed to lock the door and run. So he reached out and flipped the lock on the door. That's whenever the door started to tap again. The boy was knocking, not hard, not urgently, just knocking. He was doing it kind of soft, and for some crazy reason, Tom's mind flew to this idea. I wonder if he's trying to get my help without waking up somebody out in the woods. He doesn't know where that came from, but he said it was like an imperative that he think that. So he did. He said, and I kind of backed away from the door, and I was terrified. And I grabbed my dad's rifle. It was hanging above the mantle. I knew it was loaded. I had checked it when I first got there that day, he said. And then he heard the little boy calling out again, "Hey, mister, can I come inside?" No emotion to it at all, just like he knew he was supposed to say it, so he said it. And Tom just yelled out, "No, go away." Didn't hear anything else. He didn't hear footsteps. He didn't hear anything, just silence. And then all of a sudden, from around the side of the cabin, he heard the knock on the back wall, not the window, not the back door, but the back wall. And he knew that kid was literally 10, 12 inches away from that wall and him. And the boy was back there saying, "Hey, mister, let me in. I'm cold." Again, no emotion, just completely calm. Tom pulled a chair up with the fire at his back, and he watched between the two doors, both of which were locked. He heard the boy out there. He heard a little bit of the sticks and the leaves rattling. The boy, he wasn't going out there till dawn. He didn't care what happened. He wasn't going out because that boy scared him. At dawn, he decided to open the door, and he saw nothing out there, nobody, nothing was disturbed. And he almost convinced himself that everything was just a hallucination brought on by the stress of being where his dad and he had had such good times. And that was until he looked down. You see, there were no footprints going up, but in the frost, as though the boy had been out there until just before he opened the door and had just stepped down, there were footprints leading away from the door, down the steps. And he had to wonder if the boy had been standing at the door the whole night, waiting in case he opened the door. He sold the cabin after that. It no longer belongs to Tom's family. This story came from a bunch of several hikers who were coming from Harrisburg, a couple friends, and they were camping near an old fire road that runs parallel to the ridge. So I don't know how many folks know this, but almost every state I know of, they cut these fire roads. They're really nice roads capable of handling 2 lanes of traffic through the woods and up over the mountains and what have you. They're used for fire roads, exactly that. In case there's a fire you need to stop a forest fire, you have good access. The roads are usually gravel, and they're usually blocked off at the ends, but you can pretty much cross the state of Pennsylvania and barely touch pavement on a fire road. So, and they weren't blocked off until about 20 years ago. So people traveled them, and a lot of people still walk up them, and they camp near them because they're an identifiable piece of terrain that'll get you back to where you started if you need it. Now, the fire road ran parallel to the ridge there. It was about 2 a.m. when they heard kids whispering outside of their tent. It was what woke them up. It wasn't laughing. It wasn't talking. It was that of whispering. The one man, he unzipped the tent just a little and shined his flashlight toward the tree line. There was nothing close by, but he caught that motion at the tree line, and he flipped his light in that direction. And there were 3 figures standing below the edge of the pine trees there, 2 little boys and a little girl. They were all motionless, just standing way over there and watching the tent. Their eyes reflected absolutely nothing. The light simply died when it touched them, as though they absorbed it. They didn't move, they didn't blink, they didn't breathe. His friend yelled out, "Hey, what do you want?" Kids didn't make a sound. The man muttered, and he doesn't even know where it came from, "They want us to look away." His friend looked at him and he said, "What?" He said, "They want us to look away." He felt like the words had been placed in his mouth, like somebody else had spoken them in his head, and he had to say them. They zipped up the tent, knowing it was just nylon between them and those 3 kids. The whispering got loud again, and it seemed to circle the walls of the tent. There wasn't any shadows on the tent at that point that they could discern. But then things changed. They started to hear that sound of your fingers running across nylon, and they looked up and they could see the bulge where some child's fingers were pushing against it as they walked around. This was kind of disconcerting, as you can very well imagine, at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. They could see there were three of them now. It had to be the three kids. They sat there waiting till dawn. One of them had his hunting knife. The other, he had a flashlight. And it sounds crazy that that's what they thought they were going to need for three kids. But it didn't feel crazy, not in the middle of the night. As soon as dawn came, they unzipped the tent a little bit and they looked around and there was nobody there. Nobody at all. But their campsite had changed. Something had happened. The bark along the trees right by where they had put the tent was missing. It was as though somebody had taken nails, very strong nails, and had run vertical lines on the trees. There were three sets of them, separate and distinct, with a space between, about the height of the child. The children they saw is all they could think. They went down and talked to the park ranger that morning, and he came up and inspected the site. The marks were clean, straight, deliberate. They certainly weren't an animal. He said the trees in that part of the forest were older than the rest, older than the logging records even, older than the settlement maps. He said that they grew in patterns that didn't match the rest of the ridge. And then the park ranger looked them directly in the face and said, "Fellas, I'd probably not sleep here again tonight because the children aren't the only things that watch you up here."
I wouldn't need a park ranger to tell me that.
Yeah, it's creepy. So yeah, I have to tell you, I found there was a ton of stories for this particular area, that forest. This next one is from a fellow by the name of Mark Ellery. He was a retired state police officer, and he worked in the area of that corridor of the mountains in the 1980s. He shared a story that he had been driving the upper switchbacks during a sleet storm, traveling from one call to the next, when he saw a kid standing inside the curve of the road where that switchback was. It was a boy of about 10 wearing a thin shirt that clung to him, and it was wet. His skin was really pale, and he caught him in the headlights because it was the middle of the night. He braked hard, terrified he was going to hit this kid, but the boy didn't flinch. The headlights didn't bug him. He just seemed to soak in the light and almost glow. He said he just stared at the cruiser when the officer, stopped. His eyes were black, and the police officer at the first, he thought it was some sort of light trick, and he described it later as it looked like holes punched through paper, the blackness of his eyes. He rolled down the window and he shouted to the kid to get off the road, but the boy didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't even seem to shiver, even though he was freezing cold and wet. Finally, the police officer stepped out of the car, his hand on his holster, wondering if the kid was there as a plant to get him to stop, to get somebody to stop. And he took 2 steps toward the kid. But that's when the boy spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, no tone to it. It just didn't match the fear that was climbing up this officer's throat. He said, "You shouldn't be here," to the officer. Mark's mouth went dry. The words were wrong, like they were coming from somewhere deeper than the kid's throat. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He backed back towards the cruiser, and when he looked away for just a heartbeat, enough to make sure that he could get in the car door, the boy was gone. No footprints in the slush, no sound, just the sleet and the echo of a voice. "You shouldn't be here." Now, Mark filed no police report. He only told the story after he retired. And even then, he said it was like something had followed him home for weeks afterward. Something that stood at the corner of the bedroom where the shadows pulled. He'd wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. His wife would ask him what's wrong. And all we could hear inside his head is, "You shouldn't be here." The next story is a story of an old logging clearing road. And this one's more folklore than an eyewitness account, but we're going to share it because it's well known in the area. The locals up there talk about a clearing about halfway up the ridge where the log crews used to camp in the 1920s. The stumps are all gone. They're swallowed up by the moss and the undergrowth. And it is a place, though, that feels wrong. It's quiet. It's too open. It's like in that spot, the woods are holding their breath. The story says that there was a girl that appeared there at dusk to some of the loggers. She was always barefoot. She was always wearing a dress that belonged like to another century. It was long and ill-fitting. Her eyes were black and her voice was soft, almost like she was pleading. She'd ask travelers, "Have you seen my brother?" And she would just disappear. On more the nights than they cared to admit, the loggers would find themselves suddenly face to face with her. Maybe they were stepping away into the woods to go to the bathroom, or they were carrying their wash water to the edge of the encampment to dump it, or dumping out the last of the coffee. Whatever it was, she just sort of appeared out of nowhere, always asking, "Have you seen my brother?" People say she never fully stepped into the clearing, always staying on the edge of the trees. She was always half hidden, as if holding herself into place, watching them from a distance until they happened upon her. In some of the stories, they talk about her as a ghost of the logging camp, a child who had frozen to death, whose old man had brought her out there because he had no one to watch her and he needed to keep logging. Others say that she's not a kid at all. She's just something wearing the shape of one. Something that whatever else is in the woods puts out there as bait to see if you'll step into the woods to help her find her brother. Now, the oldest version of this story has been told for almost a century. They say sometimes you'll hear a second set of footsteps behind you when you walk through that area, when you step into the tree lines. They're not hers. They're something bigger, heavier, louder, something that doesn't breathe. Well, it doesn't breathe like a human does. No one has ever found a story about a girl freezing to death up there or a little boy getting lost. But whatever she is, whoever she was, whatever she's doing, anybody who's encountered her will tell you she's terrifying because she has no eyes. Just that ill-fitting dress and that plaintive voice. "Have you seen my brother?" In 2002, there were two geology students from Penn State mapping the exposed rock faces on that ridge. They stayed up late because they had decided to camp there and finish their project before the weather got cold. As the light faded, they heard what sounded like children laughing in the trees above them. Not playful laughing, but hollow, like the sound of being pushed through a narrow space. You know, that weird sound of a kid whenever they think that they got one up on you. That sound. They thought maybe there was a family nearby that had been hiking and maybe one of the kids got lost, or that some local kids were out there and just taking the advantage of them not knowing. Every so often, this laughter would cut off, just like somebody turned off a recording. But this laughter wasn't recorded. It wasn't canned. You could hear that it was real. And then from the top of the rock face that they had been mapping, they saw three little figures standing against the last of the light. The students said the figures were motionless, standing shoulder to shoulder, their heads tilted at the same angle, almost like a reflection of each other. One of the students picked up a flashlight and shined it in that direction. The beam hit their faces and the light died. Not dimmed, it went out. But before it went out, they saw their eyes. They were black, just black holes. The students packed up immediately and took off. They stumbled down the slopes in the darkness. When they hit the trailhead, they realized something was wrong with their equipment. Every photograph they had taken that day was corrupted. Not erased, not blurred, but streaked with vertical black lines, as if something had dragged their fingers over the film. One of the students refused to complete the project. She would rather take a bad grade. The other went back a week later with her professor. They found the rocks unchanged. The trees were stripped of bark in long, straight lines, though. 3 sets of them, about the height of a child, as though a child had stood there carefully, digging their hands through it or peeling it back. Straight vertical lines in the trees around where they saw the kids. It was the same kind of thing as the first one, where something had had cut through the bark. And there were 3 sets of them. Our next story, this one's called The Hollow-Faced Man. The woods, as you climb north in Pennsylvania, they get thicker. This was at one point virgin forest. It's been logged out for a couple times, but the trees grow fast. Pine trees go pretty fast. And these pines are tall, their trunks like pillars. Their needles whisper a swishing sound that's older than time. The air is thin and sharp and colder up in those mountains. Even the birds don't stay there long. There was a fellow that was named Harold Mallory. Now, Harold was the very first fella to see this being. He was working on the ridge, cutting trees. It was nearly just that quiet moment right before dawn. He had got out there early. He wanted to get done early that day. And he was just cutting trees. By afternoon, the light had gotten this weird burnished color right before the sun sets, and he was tired. He wiped the sweat off his brow and sat down for a moment against one of the trees, listening to the wind shift above him. And that's when he heard it. Soft, deliberate crunch in the leaves by him. It was behind him. He turned a little and yelled, "Who's there?" He thought it was one of the other fellas. There wasn't any answer at all. He turned a little more fully because he thought he saw a man, and he realized as he stood up, what he was seeing was a broad-shouldered, tall man wearing a black coat that hung strangely loose around his limbs. The figure stepped forward, and Henry's breath caught in his chest, because this man didn't have a face. Not a blank face, not a hollow face. It was like someone had carved out the front of his skull, leaving nothing but black, empty cavity, where the eyes, the nose, and the mouth should have been. The edges of the hollow were smooth, almost polished, like bone that had been worn over centuries. Henry stumbled back, his boots slipping in the pine needles. "Stay back," he whispered. The figure tilted its head as it studied him. The hollow where his face should have been seemed to suck in the light, swallowing it. Henry felt the cold, the dread, as though winter had come. But the cold wasn't from the outside. It was from the man with no face. Figures took another step forward, and Henry stumbled back again. "Don't," he said, "don't come any closer." But the hollow-faced man didn't stop. He didn't walk either. He kind of glided, his feet never really disturbing the forest floor now. Although Henry knew he had heard him step earlier. And that coat just kind of trailed behind him like tendrils of smoke as he moved. Henry turned and ran. He left the axe. He left everything. Branches hit him in the face. Roots tripped him. His breath tore in and out of his lungs. He had to go. He had to go. And behind him, there was nothing. No sound, no footsteps, no breathing. But he knew whatever it was closing in on him. He could feel it. It was cold like winter. Cold like a grave. When he finally burst into the clearing where the other loggers were working, he collapsed to his knees. He was gasping for breath. "What happened?" one of them asked. Henry could only point toward the trees. He knew it was behind him. He'd seen it just seconds ago. But there wasn't anything there, just the trees. Tall and silent, like forever. Henry quit his job that day. The other loggers, even though Henry didn't tell them anything, started to grow uneasy. They say that when they found the old spruce tree he had been leaning against, the bark was stripped clear off in the shape of a human hand. The wood beneath was bleached like bone. If you keep moving, sometimes they don't get you. Then again, sometimes they follow. There are literally hundreds of these stories from all across the country. I have collected them from Alaska all the way into Mexico. Beings that stand in the edge of the woods or in the shadows of the desert dunes, wherever, always the same, watching. I want to share a story from the Cascade Mountains. Now, the Cascade Mountains, they rise like the backs of sleeping animals, kind of humble, not sharp and pointed. And then suddenly it's as if the earth rears itself up as you get further up into the northern Cascades. They're not the gentle mountains anymore. They're jagged and snow-bitten, carved out of ice and wind over time. And even in the summer, there's a chill in your bones when you get up there. It's always cool. In 1937, there was a mountaineer by the name of Elias Crowther who encountered something up there he would later learn had a name. But we'll talk about it in a minute. And I thought this was particularly apropos because you're going to understand having heard the last story. According to Elias, he had been climbing since dawn, his breath fogging the air in thick white plumes. The snow was knee-deep and powdery on top, but hard beneath, kind of crunchy. And he knew he had to watch out, so he had a staff in his hand. He kept poking ahead because there were crevasses that could open up right underneath you. His boots crunched rhythmically. It was walk, walk, tap, tap, walk, tap, tap. And the world around him was white and gray and quiet. It was late afternoon and the sky had begun to get that bruised look right before dusk. Clouds were rolling in from the west, heavy and low. He really wasn't worried. He had done this before. He just needed to get a camp made so he could get settled in before the storm hit the ridge. He knew it was coming. He had known all day, but he liked that kind of weather. He liked the challenge. He chose the spine of rock that promised a view of the valley below, where he could shelter himself, and tucked his little tent in there. The wind got stiff. It didn't howl or whistle. It just got stiff, and then it would stop, like something was listening. Elias had an ice axe in his hand. He was chipping through some ice to kind of work his little tent back in there better, out of the wind. It was as though the birds and everything had stopped. There was no sound at all. And he felt that he wasn't alone. He didn't know why. But he looked around and he yelled, "Hello? Is there anybody out there?" There was nothing but silence. His eyes were darting back and forth, his head turning on a swivel. Something was out there. Someone was out there. He knew it. He had never had this feeling before. This was not his first trip up here. He knew this place like the back of his hand, but he had never felt it feel like this before. Again, he cried out, "Hello, is there somebody out there?" He grasped that axe a little tighter than he normally would. Silence was deafening. And then he saw a figure up on the ridge above him, watching him. It was outlined against the darkening sky. He thought it was a climber at first, someone who maybe he was caught by the storm. But as he stepped forward to get a better look, the details sharpened, and this breath caught in his throat. This figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin beneath tattered clothing, fluttering in the wind. Elias didn't feel any wind, but whatever it was seemed like it was in the middle of a gale. Skin was pale, not white. It was like the color of frostbite. And its eyes were faintly blue, like ice chips. Elias swallowed hard. He yelled, "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" Figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Elias took another step forward, his boots crunching. And that's when it hit him. The temperature plunged. It had to be 40 degrees colder, not naturally, not with the wind, just suddenly violently cold, like so cold it was stealing his breath. Frost plumed up instantly in his beard, his eyelashes, the metal of his axe, his breath crystallized. What the hell, he whispered. He pulled his coat tighter, and the figure tilted its head, the motion slow and stiff, as if its neck were frozen. Elias felt something then, not fear, but a primal recognition. This wasn't a man, this wasn't a ghost. This was winter itself, and it had taken this shape. He would later describe it as the cold walker, and it took a step toward him. The snow beneath it didn't crunch, it melted. Steam rose in thin tendrils around its boots, curled up like fingers around its knees. Elias stumbled back, slipping in the ice, his heart hammering. Stay back, he screamed, his voice violent as it cracked. The cold walker continued forward, slow, its glowing eyes fixed on him. The air around it shimmered, and the cold was so intense that it made him want to stop, to seek the safety of the tent. But with that tent would be death. Elias turned and he just ran. The wind returned all of a sudden, howling in the trees, whipping the snow in his face. He couldn't see, his lungs burned, his fingers were numb. Behind him there was nothing, no footsteps, no breathing, just that cold closing in on him like knives. He didn't stop running until he reached the tree line. When the snow thinned, it suddenly got warm again. Well, warm meaning he could survive it. When he finally dared to turn back and look, there was nothing on the ridge. But the snow where the cold walker had stood had melted in a perfect circle, steaming, refreezing. He never climbed the ridge again. In fact, he didn't even go back for his gear. He would talk to the rangers later on, and he would ask them, and they would confirm for him that they would come across these melted patches of snow in the dead of winter, always in the high ridges, always after storms, and always perfect circles. Some say the cold walker is the ghost of a climber who froze to death or doomed to wander the mountain in search of warmth. Others say he's something far older, a winter demon, a harbinger of the storms, something the native people warned them to stay away from when the first whites came there. The old mountaineers, the ones who had seen a whole lot, they tell a different story. They say he's the mountain's memory. The cold has never left. The winter never ends. The breath of the earth itself is frozen. And with it, the cold walker continues to walk. Now, if you guys like these stories, then I would love to share some more with you next week, because we've only begun to find out what might be in the tree line. Good night.